Hello everyone. This video is of course part of the fundraising series for the Ukrainian refugees. Of course, whatever you can give is greatly appreciated. Now on with the video. So last week, when I left off, we were talking about the 3 canon episodes and canon storylines of the Kriosians and what we can garner from these episodes and understanding. So this week's episode is going to be not an entire summary of Kriosian history, because looking at the script, I will likely cover the fall of Krios in a separate video where I'm able to go into greater detail. What I will do here is describe the Kriosian Empire as it existed in its prime and how the various structures and institutions functioned. I'll also then do a separate video on the Kriosian fleet, doing a technical breakdown of all the ships. So this is just going to be a summary of the Kriosian Empire as it existed roughly in the 22nd century and how it plays into the overall astropolitical context of that period. So there are a couple people who are actually very on point with my headcanon. They've already guessed what I'm going to say. You guys know who you are. Pat yourselves on the back. Because one of the people predicted that the Kriosian Empire emerges in the aftermath of some kind of collapse. Something like, or equivalent to, the Bronze Age collapse. So, in the Bronze Age collapse, I don't know this period of history particularly well, but the Greeks were the only ones to emerge as a major civilization. And of course they were eventually conquered by the Romans. This is close, but I will go into more detail. So, there was a collapse. The collapse was of the ancient Orion empires. Now, Orion history is long and storied and complicated, and I won't go back because then you're talking about ancient Rigelian empires and it gets pretty out of hand pretty quickly. Essentially, what we would describe as the early modern period, the Orions were the preeminent astropolitical power, and they divided their rule across several empires ruled by different clans. Now the trouble was that these clans were constantly fighting among themselves, and this eventually brought the collapse of the great Orion empires. But the Orions do not lose their dominance in overall astropolitics. But a new system comes in that allows the Orions to preserve their power whilst also stepping back from sort of the frontline roles and letting basically other powers do the business of ruling planets and star systems while the Orions reap the benefits. This system is known as Pax Orionis, and it emerged around about the 18th, 19th century as the last of the Orion empires collapsed. So I suppose I should summarize what the Pax Orionis is. The Pax Orionis is a system of decentralized rule or influence networks, a series of networks of influence. The idea is to prevent internal feuding among Orion clans. This is basically the basis of the Orion Syndicate, in which the Orion clans cooperate together in order to control and manipulate the other major powers of the region. Even as the borders of the Orion empires receded, they were leaving behind friendly regimes in their place, and they basically form a whole web of powers that are friendly to the Orions. The Orions still wield a colossal amount of soft influence and power, and again I'll get into the specifics of what those are, but that's basically the fundamental roots of the Pax Orionis, and that authority is essentially ingrained in the Orion Syndicate, and that is basically the hold-all term for all the various Orion clans. The Orion Syndicate is really the key to understanding the Beta Quadrant in the 20th, 21st, and 22nd century. The Orion Syndicate controls trade, and he who controls trade controls the quadrant. Now, this does mean that the Orions themselves have a portion of a military, but it's generally quite a small privateer force that engages in, obviously, defending the trade routes. In terms of actual large-scale military power, the Orions are largely reliant on their various client races. So, the Rigelians, the Malurians, the Enolians, the Ossarians, and the Kriosians. These are really the ones who have the main locuses of power, but the Orions maintain basically a wide network of trade across the quadrant that these powers all feed into. Essentially, the way the Pax Orionis works, the contract of the Pax Orionis, is that the Orions will control and chart trade routes and facilitate secure and profitable trade for everyone while taking their fair cut. And in return, what you must give in return is loyalty to the Orion Syndicate and the Orion clans. Essentially, it's a very hands-off affair, and as far as they're concerned, if the various powers want to fight amongst themselves, that's fine, as long as the trade flows. That is most important. The trade must flow, or there's no syndicate, there's no Pax Orionis, and the entire system on which the prosperity of the Beta Quadrant rests collapses. So they will allow war and infighting among the different powers, provided it does not interfere with their trade. If it does interfere with their trade, they'll start to intervene. Now, they can intervene and influence societies through various means, and this is basically through economic pressures, obviously, so trade wars, tariffs, taxes, stuff like this. Also, through more grey measures, shall we say, such as using corruption and extortion, bribery. The Orions are not above doing this. They have their legitimate means, but they also have plenty of less respectable means, shall we say. And one of these others, and one of these final means of control, is through infiltration. It's a form of soft power, infiltration and subversion. So one of the things, because of the continued cultural influence and cultural capital that the Orions wield, is they have the very famous Orion University. And if you're anyone in the Beta Quadrant, if you're anyone of consequence, your children will be attending the Orion University, where, you know, the Orions will instill in them the importance of the Pax Orionis and the importance of cooperation in this system. So that's a bit of soft influence. But one of the other main forms aren't above using infiltrators who disguise themselves and infiltrate and subvert governments to make sure that they get the most favourable conditions. And then thirdly, they use a sort of more obvious form of influence or subversion, and that is through courtesans, targeting the wealthy ruling elites of the various powers. Orion courtesans are very highly prized and sought after, and a sign of status. But they also allow the Orions to literally have the ear of the most important people in the quadrant. So it gives them a huge amount of both economic power, but also a lot of cultural, a lot of personal influence, and a lot of soft cultural influence, reminiscent of Britain post the Empire, where we still have all these very respected and internationally recognised institutions. So I brought up the Pax Orionis, and it's important because it does feed into the overall context of the pre-Federation Beta Quadrant, and also the context of the Kriosians. The Kriosians are part of the Pax Orionis. Their empire was formed roughly around about 19th, 20th century, so already the Pax Orionis was pretty much in place, and they greatly benefit from it. They are the foremost, they have over time become the foremost military power in the region, so they will import a lot of war material, particularly from, say, the Malurians, mine a lot of exotic and dangerous isotopes used in weapons construction. again, that's part of the trade network. So generally, what the Kriosians will import is luxury items for the aristocracy, war material to maintain their forces, and then they will export foodstuffs, crops. Kriosian space is perhaps some of the richest in the entire Beta Quadrant. It's very, very wealthy in terms of the fertility of of a lot of the planets. Krios Prime is essentially, it is a forest world. It is highly fertile and extremely wealthy in terms of crops. And so that's a huge export for them. They also export from some of the other planets precious stones as well, but it's a very largely agrarian sort of style society, and this is because of the vast wealth that has been brought to them by that. They just double down on it because the other societies, especially the Malurians, who have a habit of strip mining any planet they come across, don't really have the ability to feed themselves, so are very much reliant on Kriosian exports. And again, this is all facilitated under the Pax Orionis and the Orion Syndicate and those trade networks. This is why it's so important, because it's what connects all these various powers together in a very beneficial alliance that has allowed for the incredible wealth of the Beta Quadrant, and in this specific video, the wealth of the Kriosian Empire. That's the first thing to really address is, in terms of the structure of the Kriosian Empire, it's a imperial system, sort of basically feudal system. At the top, you have the monarch, or the sovereign, and they reside here on Krios Prime, which is basically at the center of the Kriosian Empire. The rest of the empire is divided amongst the 5 great houses. So the first house to really mention is House Volt. House Volt is actually on the fringes of the Empire, and it shares borders with the Asarian Commonwealth, but also with the Orions. House Volt has grown incredibly wealthy off of trade with the Orions, which they facilitate. They don't really have much wealth or resources on their own worlds of Volt Minor, Troyes, and Arcanus. What they have is geographical advantage, which enables them to be the foremost trading family in the Empire, and this is very, very important. House Volt, more than any other, is very keen to maintain good relations with the Orion Syndicate. The next great house is House Rathan, which is on the other side of the Empire. They have the planets of Rathan and Kiros. House Rathan has some of the most abundant and fertile planets in the entire Empire. They are the primary source of most of the agricultural produce. About 60% of all the agriculture comes from the worlds of House Rathan, and they are reasonably wealthy from it, but they're very inward looking. They don't really have borders with any other major powers. They're more just interested in the internal trade within the Kriosian Empire, and then of course their export market. Next up is House Devos. Now House Devos is on the border has a small border with the Klingons, but it also has a very large border with the Usarians, and they hold the planets of Devos and Syra. They mostly trade in luxury goods, again, sort of big cultural exports, luxury items, craft items, things like that. The Asarians are very good merchants, and sort of Kriosian artwork is greatly prized amongst the other powers. It also facilitates some trade with the Klingons, but not a huge amount. So basically it's just blood wine and Raktajino, which is generally imported from the Klingons, and those are very popular in the more metropolitan areas of House Devos, and also on the capital, on Krios Prime. So next one is House Catan. The worlds of House Catan include Catan and Kita, and these are not particularly wealthy worlds in terms of natural fertility, but they are very rich in certain natural minerals present in precious stones. So House Khatan and Kieta provide most of the precious stones and precious metals used in the Empire. They also provide a lot of the raw materials used for the construction of the Kriosian fleet. But their main export are precious stones. They'll often be exported over to House Devos, or they will be traded with House Volt, who will then send them out across the Orion trade networks. Last and least of the great houses is House Kural. House Kural is not particularly wealthy. The worlds of House Kural are neither rich in mineral wealth nor in natural wealth. They border the worlds of the Klingon Empire. The worlds of House Kural are Kurat and Hos Aichu. Their main trade is with the Klingons, and as you can imagine, trade with the Klingons is not particularly profitable. But for the most part, they maintain good relations, but that really concludes our summary of the great houses of Krios. So now I'll just briefly mention the history with the Klingons. How do they interact with the Klingons? Because there's this is the other new power that really enters the Beta Quadrant. Relations with the Klingons, they're initially very tense, and there's a few skirmishes and exchanges with the Klingons. But for the most part, the Klingons learn to basically respect the Kriosians. It's certainly worth mentioning that the Kriosian fleet was very much more advanced than the Klingons when they first encountered them. The Kriosians had a substantial tech advantage, whereas the Klingon ships were quite weak and fragile things and weren't really... It's worth bearing that in mind. Times change. But that basically brought about a respectable peace between the two powers. Not to say that there aren't Klingon raids, but if there are, there's reprisals. And also, by the early modern period, by the pre-Federation period, the Klingons have bigger fish to fry. That being the Orions. So while culturally the Klingons have a lot in common with the Kriosians, including a very similar language, similar culture and customs and values, there are somewhat competing forces, because the Kriosians are very much part of the Pax Orionis, and this fundamentally puts them at some level of odds with the Klingons, who are seeking to destroy the Pax Orionis. And that is really where the initial tensions and the points of crisis emerge between the Klingons and the Kriosians. It's fundamentally in their relation to the Orion Syndicate, which is the main focus of the Klingons' attention in this period. And that is what we'll be delving into in the Fall of Krios. But before then, next week, we'll take a look at the ships of the Kriosian fleet. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you all next time.